As always, last night's GOP debate left us a big steaming pile of inaccuracies and outright lies and just terrible deception that we like to weed through the day after the debate. Now, we don't have time to address all of the lies that were told, but we do want to cover at least a few so that going into the post-debate couple of weeks for the next one, you understand what's going on and you won't be misled. So here are a few of the ones that stood out to me. Donald Trump said, when you look at the line of immigration, you see no women. He's talking about Syrians here. Where are the women? I see no women. I see strong, powerful men.
Wow.
He's a ladies' man. We've just discussed that Donald's a ladies' man.
Yeah. He goes out to the shore and he sees the boats of Syrian refugees. He's like, where are the women?
Where are the babes?
Yeah.
Not only Syrian women are babes. What's going on?
He just sees these strong, rippling-abs men. They're just amazing looking. Now,
fucking
the
sausage party with these Syrians.
Sausage party. Get off my coast.
Come on.
Now, in truth, in the last fiscal year, the United States admitted almost 1,700 Syrian refugees, 77% of whom were women and children.
I don't see them.
He doesn't
I don't see them. I don't. That's not what
are smaller,
many
granted.
people. All the phone calls I've gotten that say they don't see them.
They don't see them.
Many top people say that they've called.
If he did see them, he would see them cheering for the downfall of America.
Experts.
Many of the experts in watching in Syrians say they haven't seen any. Many of the top
It's a
Syrian
horrible
watchers.
situation, the worst since there were Syrians.
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster.
It's
It's phenomenally
We're going to
disastrous.
sort it out. Don't worry.
He's going to sort it out.
Make it great.
But
Yes.
it's par for the course for Trump and the Republican Party. It's about fear-mongering. It's about smearing the refugees and making them out to be dangerous individuals that are going to come after you and hurt you.
Yeah.
And it unfortunately resonates with the Republican Party, right? He's giving them exactly what they want. The Republican Party is full of a bunch of pussies, right? They're afraid of everything, and they need a candidate who's going to play into those fears. And that's exactly what Trump does. And he succeeds in it. You think they're going to go online and check the facts on that?
No.
I was surprised last night when I was watching it. I was surprised that he didn't in particular bring up, given his anti-Muslim position, bring up what we've seen unfold in Europe over New Year's Eve with the reported attacks that went on in Cologne in particular,
That's true.
and other cities in Germany. When I say reported attacks, there's nothing inaccurate about them, but we're getting 200 reports of 200 women. I'm sure you guys covered it.
Yeah.
It
was surprising that it wasn't
that he
brought
didn't
up,
sort
actually.
of say this is a direct result of mass immigration, and this is why we need to be pushing back, because although these individuals, I don't think there's been any specific arrests as of yet, but in terms of the people that have been detained, there's some of them fit the profile of being North African, Moroccan.
Yes.
So in terms of, and there were one or two Iraqis, Syrians. So, but as I said, there haven't been any specific arrests and no releases have been made. But I'm surprised he didn't
bring that
sort
up.
of say, as a result of look at what's happening in Europe, do you really want that replicated here?
Yeah, I mean, look, that would have been a very easy and convincing way to play into that fear-mongering. But in order for him to do that, he would actually need to know and be aware of what's happening in the world.
Yes.
And he has no idea. I don't think he even knows.
He spends so much time on Twitter. How does he not get this news? He's on Twitter all day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. He's playing into the fears. And so people who feel the fear of these refugees coming in or immigrants from that part of the world, understand that while to you this might seem like this is this unique thing that I'm experiencing, this has been experienced in reference to every immigrant community in the history of immigrants. Every time people came over to America, we were afraid that they were lawless. If they're Irish, they're big drunks, they're going to commit crimes. The Italians, organized crime. That one actually turned out to be mostly accurate. We're always afraid of the immigrants.
The
It doesn't
Irish
matter what
thing's
they look
true
like.
too, but that doesn't matter.
No. Let me add to that. So I tweeted this. I don't know if we ever covered it on the Young Turks during the first hour, but the Washington Post did this incredible piece that showed polling numbers during World War II and the number of Americans that were in favor of taking in Jewish refugees.
Yeah.
You want to know what that percentage was?
Yeah.
5%.
Yeah, I was going to say.
5% of Americans wanted to take in Jewish refugees. We have a long history of not wanting to allow in the others, okay? It's a very Orwellian ideology. It's very us against them. We need to change our mentality and understand why these people are trying to leave their own countries and everything that they've known, everything that they've built.
Yeah.
It's not to come here and harm you. And by the way, are all of them going to be innocent? Probably not. Not everyone is innocent, right? But that's why we have a justice system. That's why we can prosecute. as I've said during the Cologne coverage that we've done, if any of those people are proven to be the attackers and they're also proven to be migrants from Syria or any other part of the Middle East, not only do you deport them, you prosecute them, you make sure justice is served, and you get them the hell out of the country.
Yes.
Right? You ensure that there are...
But okay, yeah, and I don't disagree with that. But what I think is that what he's driving at is the fundamental, and what we're talking about here with the segregation of or reluctance to take in Jewish people. There's the laws that were brought out in 1882, the anti-Asian laws with Japanese and Chinese actually, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Thank you. Is the fact that there's that cultural dislocation.
Yes.
And so what they're preying on now, what they're highlighting now, and I have some sympathy with this, but I have to couch it carefully, and I'd be interested to know what you think, is in terms of the treatment of women, specifically. Okay, so we come back to this debate about men and women again today. It's how the rich Western countries, the role of women in those countries, how that is viewed and how that is at variance to how women are portrayed and how they're viewed in Muslim countries. And that is kind of what this whole Cologne debacle is really about, right?
Yes.
It's not about the process of law, about under-policing and all of those things. It is the fact that we feel that there is a cultural mismatch, and how can we best assimilate, integrate, whatever word you want to use, when there's an onslaught that's described as an onslaught. And I have some sympathy with that when you have 1.1 million refugees arriving in Germany alone last year, with thousands more arriving every day. How you cannot but be overwhelmed.
I totally understand that.
That is really kind of the driver, right?
Yes. And look, okay, so there's so many different things that I want to respond to. But first of all, just going back to the numbers that John mentioned, if the majority of Syrian refugees are women and children, well then they're women and children that should be allowed into the country regardless of what you think about the way women are thought of or portrayed in Middle Eastern countries, right? So
Agreed.
that's point number one.
Good
point number two is there are European countries right now that have assimilation training. They don't call it assimilation training, but they're understanding that there are cultural differences. I've talked about this during the Cologne coverage, and people purposely misinterpreted what I said, okay? The cultural difference is that women are supposed to be modest, right? They're supposed to have very traditional gender roles. And that doesn't mean that all Muslim men want to rape women who aren't modest, right? They misinterpreted that and, smeared me online. But what I want to say is it's totally fine to say, look, we have cultural differences, right? Our women do not have to wear burqas. They don't have to wear headdresses. That doesn't make them immodest. That doesn't make them bad people. Our culture is different. So you have to understand that you cannot be misogynistic toward these women. You cannot,
Right, exploitative, derogatory,
exactly.
any of those things.
I think that kind of education program is completely acceptable, especially when you have stark differences like that.
Yeah, and again, I think it's totally legitimate to see the gulf in what we see as the average treatment of women in a lot of countries from the region, and how many people in our country, oddly enough, the liberals, obviously far more liberal in their view of women than the conservatives, who are the people who are so afraid of it, when they want their women to be modest and stay in the home too. That's what always strikes me as so weird. But if you go back through the history of waves of immigration, those cultures were pretty different. The Chinese culture in the 19th century is pretty different than American culture, and Japanese culture, and Latin American culture. And almost anyone that comes in from most parts of the world is probably going to be a little bit more conservative in their treatment of women compared to the United States, except for Europe, but they allow us to visit as well. Like, people are different and have different values, but America has a history of hundreds of years of integrating populations of every sort of person that appears in the world.
It was just a couple of decades ago, we didn't let black people sit in the front of the bus or eat at the lunch counters that we eat there. So as soon as we get our shit together, everyone else has to get their shit together immediately, or else you're a lower culture than us. So that's kind of fucked up. Also, the Catholics have been raping fucking boys for decades. So what's that culture about? And they've been covering that shit up. And by the way, Germany, Trump gave a speech in New Hampshire just the other day where he said, oh, the poor Germans, they never had this problem before. There are over 7,000 reported cases of rape and sexual assault in Germany every year, and which we know goes largely underreported. So using those numbers, that's 20 rapes a day in Germany. So let's stop pretending like somehow rape is not a problem in all cultures.
It's just really interesting.
It's a problem in America.
Right, it's a problem in many different countries, right? And it's interesting that when it comes to accusations of rape here in the United States, oftentimes it's met with a lot of skepticism, especially if it happens on a college campus, by the same conservatives who are taking the situation in Cologne and using it to their advantage. All of a sudden, when Muslims are the ones doing the raping, you care about rape. And they're all guilty, and they're all rapists, and they're all terrible.
Yes.
But when it comes to rape accusations and sexual assault in the United States, including ones that are done by people like Bill Cosby, there's this need to defend the rapist. Why is it that we have that issue here in the U.S., but when it comes to Muslims being accused of rape, all of a sudden, well, of course they're the ones doing the rape.
Not just them, their entire culture.
Their entire culture.
We're not, right, but hang on a second, guys.
I'm not saying you
not
specifically.
No,
I'm saying comments I get every day.
But let's put it on a level playing field.
Let's do it. Go ahead.
We're not, but you're not comparing like with like, and I don't disagree with what you're saying. But if you're gonna make that argument, make it like for like.
Okay, so how is it apples and oranges? Show me. I want to know.
Because what they're specifically concerned about is this mass mob. The specific instance that we're talking about is this mass mob instance or incidents that happened. We're talking about 1,000 individuals, upwards of 1,000 men. That when you come off the train station for New Year's Eve, you're just walking through this siege. Or swarms of guys.
Yes.
That is different from what you're describing.
Do you believe that those thousands of men, A, are all Syrian refugees or Muslim refugees that are similar to the people who are trying to get into the United States? And more importantly, do you believe that they're representative of all Muslims? Do you believe that they're representative of Muslim culture? Tell me.
No, I don't believe.
Okay.
I don't believe that. But what you're not doing is, But it's what we're talking about, and what the furore that has happened is as a result of the mass. If it was one or two, if it was apples for apples, it would be one or two instances of individuals who had raped a couple of women, and we're trying to find out who those individuals are, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about something that happened on a mass scale that is so overwhelming. So I think there's legitimacy. Whilst I don't think it's legitimate for people to question the victim in instances here, I don't think you can at the same time attack those same conservatives for getting morally outraged and trying to...
By the way, you want to know who's morally outraged about the rapes? I'm morally outraged about the rapes, okay? I want those people brought to justice. I don't give a fuck if they're Syrian refugees. I don't give a fuck what Muslim country they came from. If they're investigated and they're proven to be the rapists, I want them prosecuted, I want them in prison, and I want them sent back to whatever fucking country they came from. That's the way I feel about that story. However, I do not believe in using that instance as an example of an entire population's culture. Okay, to say that would be absolutely ridiculous. I don't think you're saying that either, but these attacks
but there are a lot of people who are.
A lot of people are, and it's driving me insane because the women and children who are trying to flee their war-torn countries because of the wrongdoings of us in the United States and our ridiculous foreign policy, they're trying to leave their countries and come here because they need peace. They're not coming here to rape our women and children. They're not coming here to do anything to us. They're coming here for freedom. They're coming here for peace, and we have a long history of denying people who had very similar issues, and we need to change that, okay? When European countries are allowing hundreds of thousands of people to come in, and the U.S. has a ridiculous debate about whether or not we want to allow 10,000 Syrian refugees to come in, the majority of which are women and children, well, what is our responsibility, right? Because a lot of the trouble that's happening in the Middle East right now is our wrongdoing. It's us going in there with our preemptive invasions, with our drone strikes, with our bombings, and all of a sudden we're going to stand back and be like, hey, you know what? We fucked up your countries, but we don't really care. We're going to allow you to deal with it yourself.
But with the same breath, though, this is where I just don't quite follow the logic of what you're saying. With the same breath, you do also acknowledge that there is still a cultural issue with women within those societies.
I'm going to lose my mind. There is a cultural difference. That doesn't mean that their cultural difference is that they're advocates of rape. Okay, there's a difference between believing that men and women are different and women need to be modest and they need to be conservative. By the way, we have people in our country that feel that way right now. I don't understand what you're trying to say. What's the difference? What's the cultural difference that you're referring to right now?
So, for example, in Egypt, they did a poll. There was a Pew Research report in Egypt. It was something. The number is 90% of men believe that women are subservient to men.
That doesn't mean that they believe it's okay to rape women. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say.
But you know what? I think if you polled the Christian conservatives in America, you would get probably that same number. So they're a more religious country. That's all. I think that maybe is reflective of more religious. So, I mean, we took our culture away from the religious fucking crazies in our country. But if you watch that Republican debate last night, they still advocate all that backward shit. They're still against healthcare for poor people. They're still against immigrants. And they're still against gay people. They don't like gay people. They don't want them to have equal rights. They've been dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And now we're in the 21st. They're still in the 1900s. So I just think that when people do that and like, oh, the Pew did a research, again, it's a different culture. It's more religious, and we're against fundamentalism, right? We're against fundamental religion. I'm against all religion, but especially fundamentalism, which is where this stuff comes from. And again, what we're doing is we're painting with a broad brush a whole culture because of something that happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne, which we don't even understand exactly what it was that happened.
Yeah, I mean, you're the one who said no one's been arrested yet, right? So we don't even know what the facts are yet. This story is still developing. We're still trying to figure out who the perpetrators are. But look, the point that I'm trying to make, and I want to reiterate it so people understand very clearly what I'm trying to say. If poll numbers indicate that a certain culture believes women need to be subservient to men, that doesn't mean that there's a direct correlation or any causation indicating that they are advocates of rape or in favor of rape or even people who excuse rape. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Those are two completely different things. Do some men who believe women should be subservient end up sexually assaulting women? I'm sure there's some percentage, right? But I don't think that there's any type of correlation there. And I think that correlation is being made online by bigots and fearmongers so we don't allow refugees into our country. And it's enraging me right now.
And so a lot of I've read a lot of writing from feminists in Germany about this, and what they're all saying is that, wow, it's really weird to see the right wing finally stick up for rape victims. And it took Arabs for them to finally figure out that rape is bad and that it's not the woman's fault. So that's another thing I think that people are overlooking too. And, you know, I'm against religion, I'm against Islam, I'm against Christianity, I'm against all of it because I think it's superstition and it's corrosive to all cultures, right? But at the same time, as a progressive, I can't allow one group of people to be demonized more than another group of people based on scapegoating, right?
Yeah. And when the base beliefs seem very similar. I mean, how many times have we had in conservative churches in America explicitly saying, including politicians, women are subservient to men?
And not only that.
That's the belief.
That's the belief.
Thankfully, not of that many Americans anymore, thankfully. But that's a stated belief of a lot of Christian churches, of conservative Christian churches.
Not only that, we have done stories, and please look through our archives and find it on our YouTube channel, because you will find it, where Christian commentators will openly and explicitly say, you cannot rape your wife if you're married to her, yes, right?
That's true.
There's no such thing as rape in a marriage. Okay, so
and a lot of laws upheld that.
There are all sorts of fundamentalists, whether it's Christian or Muslim, that have very problematic points of views when it comes to women. Okay, I think it's important to assimilate if they're gonna, migrate to a different country. I have no problem with that whatsoever. The only thing that I have a problem with is using generalizations for an entire group of people and using instances like the New Year's Eve attack, to make a statement about an entire religion, an entire group of people. I want to help people in need. Like that's my biggest issue, right? And look, my dad was born in Syria. My dad could have stayed in Syria, and he could have been a victim of all this, right? And the thought of the United States saying no to Syrian victims, I don't know. It makes me incredibly emotional and incredibly angry because I think it goes against what this country's about, okay? My people were slaughtered by the Turks, okay? Which is why there are Armenians throughout this entire world. They're part of the diaspora. My family is part of the diaspora, okay? And the idea of the U.S. not allowing my family to come into this country angers me, right? And if they were to look at them and say, you guys are terrorists, you guys are different, you guys are foreigners, we're not going to let you in because we're afraid of you, I mean, that goes against what this country's about. So that's the reason why I get emotional.
And, now there are groups of angry mobs in Germany attacking Muslims and people who they think are Muslims in Germany.
Yeah.
So is that their culture? Why are they so violent?
And look, we've had in America after 9/11, after any terror attack, it happened in Paris as well. When these things happen, immediately people go out and generally they end up, for some reason, targeting Sikhs. I don't know why. Every time they end up beating up a Sikh.
Yes,
but they go and they commit hate crimes.
Yeah,
and
Sikhs.
Yeah, and especially I think historically, and I think it's totally true of this channel, which has been around since before the Iraq War happened. We knew when we started doing this, when we went in there, we invaded multiple countries, we occupied them, we killed tens or hundreds of thousands of people, or were complicit in their killing, that we were creating an absolute mess that was going to destroy not just their lives, but that it was going to spread and it was going to cause damage. And now we see that. We see that governments have been destabilized throughout the region because we're there and because we're bombing the shit out of them. And now those people, some of them are having to flee. And for us to say, no, you can't come here, your country is shit, but you got to deal with it, when we help to cause that situation. I think that that's one of the things that makes us hardest to accept. It's not just that it's the most supposedly religious people in America who are saying, no, we can't help out the downtrodden and those who are fleeing war and just want peace and all that. It's that they were also the ones who were most vociferously supportive of every one of these foreign adventures that has contributed in various ways to the situation we have today. It's like they smashed all of that shit, and now some of it has come back, and they're like, that's incredibly frustrating.